Hi folks, dependency theories is what we're talking about today in video 2. And you should take a moment to set up your notes to look like these. The first theory that we're going to talk about is Roscoes' modernization theory. And this guy was a US economist in the 1960s that was following a really European-based study or European-based framework. And what it was kind of motivated by was the decolonization movement was going on in the 1960s. So we see those European colonial powers start granting political independence to their colonies in Africa and Asia. And so economists wanted to look to these really powerful economic countries in the West as models to show former colonies how they could work to become more developed. However, it treats all countries the same. So it assumes that every country will take the exact same path to development. And so it's kind of like a framework to becoming an MDC. And it's based on these 5 stages. So I'm going to talk about these in depth. The first stage is traditional society. This is countries that are still in stage 2 of the DTM, and their lives are really based on primary economic activities like subsistence agriculture, and still really labor-intensive activities. So there is limited technology and limited capital. Some examples of countries that are in stage 1 are like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Haiti, Nepal, Yemen, or some sub-Saharan African countries. Stage 2 is called preconditions to takeoff. This is when we start to see agricultural surpluses develop, which allows for a transition to more commercial agriculture. Once a country starts investing money in factories and infrastructure development, we really see a lot of movement forward. So some new technologies that happen in stage 2 are things like advanced transportation systems like roads and highways and railroad connectivity. Some examples of countries that are in stage 2 are like Nicaragua and Pakistan. Stage 3 is called takeoff, but it is the industrialization stage. So this refers to countries that are in stage 3 of the DTM that are beginning to go through a period of industrialization, and we see political leaders encourage people to start to produce goods for sale, so attempt to try to make things for profit rather than just for their own use. However, it's important to know that the infrastructure is important because you have to have some sort of infrastructure to trade. We also see manufacturing become the most dominant activity. So this is really a transition to secondary economic activities. And we see urbanization increase as well as technological development. We also see greater individualism, which means that people are really worried about themselves and their own success rather than like a communal society view of that. And some examples are the newly industrialized countries. So these are places like the Philippines, India, China, Vietnam, and Nigeria. Stage 4 is called the drive to maturity. Industrialization here becomes very specialized. So workers become skilled in a specific trade, and this means that they are making more money. So as people become more prosperous, they are able to afford luxuries like material goods. So we see a lot of buying in stage number 4. We see even more rapid urbanization, and international trade becomes dominant. Population growth begins to slow here because children are requiring schooling, and children are much more expensive at stage 4. In addition to that, they're no longer needed to help on their family farms anymore since it's not a subsistence agricultural society. Some examples of stage 4 countries are Mexico, Brazil, Russia, and some Eastern European countries like Belarus and Hungary. Stage number 5 is called high mass consumption. This is when we see society begin to deindustrialize, so we see a decline in manufacturing, and it transitions to a service-oriented economy. So remember, service jobs are tertiary jobs. We see high incomes as the population becomes involved in these tertiary jobs, and widespread production and consumption of consumer goods. So people are buying, buying, buying. We also see international trade expand even more than it did in stage 4, and population growth either slows down or becomes stable. Some examples of places like this are the United States, Japan, Germany, and England. So strategies of development in this model are industrialization. We also see large-scale development projects and the buildup of technology. And so some other ways that LDCs could work to become higher up on this ladder is to try to control population growth. And we see a lot of MDCs providing foreign aid and investments to LDCs. So this is typically used for large-scale industrialization projects, so like building power plants or building roads in a country. We also see things like the Green Revolution, where MDCs are sharing agricultural technology to try to help increase food production. And we see kind of just the sharing of technology all around. However, there are some criticisms of this theory. First of all, it has a Western bias. It assumes all countries should follow the exact same path that Great Britain and the United States did, which is not necessarily true. And it doesn't account for any cultural differences. So, for example, in the West, wealth and profit is regarded as a sign of success and importance, which is very capitalist. However, a lot of traditional societies emphasize things like family and kinship, and communal living in villages. So not all people value kind of the motive to get to this high mass consumption. It also doesn't consider the colonial history, that a lot of colonies are coming from a point of weakness because they were once controlled by these Western powers, and they've had most of their valuable resources either taken from them or are owned by multinational corporations to this day. So places like Coca-Cola, Shell, IBM, Folgers, they own a lot of natural resource deposits in these least developed countries. And then the third criticism is just about sustainability. The modernization theory does not take into account all of the environmental issues that are associated with the traditional industrialization path. All right, dependency theory, structuralist theory, and world systems theory all go together. And so generally, structuralist and dependency theory have to do with this idea of neocolonialism. And this idea, it takes into account the economic disparities between more developed and less developed countries because of that colonial history. So due to colonization, the West has built up this world economy in a way in which they are exploiting these other countries. So if you check out this map here, it's divided into 3 different types of countries: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And so the core countries are those Western developed countries. And due to industrialization, that's where all of the manufacturing has been done. In the periphery and semi-periphery countries, that's where we see natural resources being extracted. So that's where we get the raw materials at really cheap prices to create those manufactured goods. And so economic development, according to structuralist or dependency theory, for LDCs is really dependent on the fact that these core countries have taken them over and exploited them. That's where we get the term dependent, that these least developed countries are highly dependent on foreign-owned factories, foreign direct investment, and technology coming from those core countries to provide employment and infrastructure in their countries. So here's an example. A lot of these periphery countries borrow loans from either the First World or the International Monetary Fund, and this investment is used to help pay for building of new industry and infrastructure. However, the money made by those LDCs from the sale of their goods is then used to pay off their loans. So it's kind of like this never-ending cycle of taking out a loan and then paying it off. So in the end, we don't see a lot of profits or development in these countries. So they're not able to invest in their own businesses or their own infrastructure. So this also, dependency theory, is also categorized by this image right here, where we see the core countries are making high profits and are consuming those material goods. However, they are exploiting the semi-periphery and the periphery countries for those cheap labors and raw materials, right? So the periphery supplies cheap labor and raw materials. The core has high profits and a lot of consumption goods. The semi-periphery kind of works in this middle space. The semi-periphery is exploited by the core. However, they still work to exploit those periphery countries as well. So an example of structuralist or dependency theory is Wallerstein's world systems theory. And this is exactly what we were just talking about, the three-tier structure that considers relationships among development processes, right? So what are the interconnections between specific countries, and what does that have to do with their economic development? And so, as I just explained, we see those MDCs in the core. They fuel the world economy by taking raw materials from around the world. Semi-periphery countries are the newly industrialized ones, like China, Mexico, Brazil, India, Russia. And they are exerting more power than peripheral countries, but not dominated to the same degree by the core. And the peripheries are the least developed countries in our world, so Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And remember, this is in part due to the colonial exploitation and their constant support of rich countries by providing inexpensive labor and a large market for the industrial products. So some strategies used in the development, according to Wallerstein, are things like import substitution and nationalization of resources. So what import substitution means is, instead of buying first world consumer products like laundry soap, for example, like Tide or Coca-Cola, this approach calls for building factories in countries themselves and producing it there in those countries in their own factories. So that way the profits from that manufacturing are benefiting the banks and the investment opportunities in those least developed countries rather than getting sent back to the more developed countries. Another example is nationalization of natural resources. And so as I'm talking about MDCs still dominating LDCs, this is how it's done. We see foreign corporate ownerships of oil fields and mines and forests, and all of these things restrict the national government and local companies that are actually in that country itself. So if these resources are nationalized, meaning that the foreign companies are kicked out, then the money made from the production of those resources can be used for local economic development in that country. So for instance, in 1910, the US owned 20% of Mexican land because it was in ownership of all of its oil resources. However, there was a movement in Mexico to nationalize those oil fields. The same thing's happening right now in Bolivia. So these are strategies that allow those least developed countries to become more developed in this world systems theory or dependency theory. So the neoliberal counter-revolution is the idea that free market and laissez-faire approach to development is best, and it argues that having a state-owned industry means that they are more dependent than less dependent. So In the neoliberal counter-revolution, we see privatization of industry. We see a rejection of investments and a reduced role of the state. So the country's government is not involved in development at all, and they value things like free trade.